Democracy now. Those are the words written on signs held by young Israelis in the streets of Tel Aviv on Saturday. Waving rainbow flags and carrying torches, thousands of protesters marched against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's new government, considered one of the most right-wing in the country's history.
I came to protest to defend my future as an Israeli and as a Jew that wants to live in a democratic and safe country.
I'm sure that these demonstrations will grow and grow and grow, and at the end will oust this government.
Netanyahu took office last month after winning the elections back in November. The 73-year-old prime minister, who is fighting corruption charges in court, has served as premier longer than anyone else. He is now at the head of a coalition with extreme right and ultra-Orthodox Jewish parties. The new government has announced worrisome policies that include expanding settlements in the occupied West Bank, introducing a program that allows parliament to override decisions of the Supreme Court, and social reforms that are raising concern among the LGBTQ community.
And we can see right now many laws being advocated for against LGBTQ, against Palestinians, against larger minorities in Israel. And we are here to say loud and clear that all of us, Arabs and Jews and different various communities inside of Israel, demand peace, equality, justice for all of us, and that this is the home of all of us, and we're going to fight for it.
The opposition has accused the government of endangering Israel's entire legal system and says the latest reforms undermine its democratic institutions.
Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at Yeshiva University here in New York City, John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and Touro College. An American Dilemma, written in 1954, was the classic sociological effort to understand the moral contradictions of American democracy. White America said one thing about its allegiance to its highest values and ideals, but practiced another in its blatant racial discrimination and pervasive violation of the dignity and rights of Blacks. In other words, it said one thing and it did another. It was a dilemma no country or individual could maintain without a breakdown of its character and the basic institutional structures of its civilization. In the last couple of weeks, hundreds of thousands of Israelis are protesting against the most right-wing and religiously conservative government in its history and their policies and politics, which have bitterly divided the country. The protesters say it's a battle over values for the soul of Israel's democracy. Israel's ceremonial president, Isaac Herzog, has called for compromise and warned that the crisis had left the country on the brink of constitutional and social collapse. A former defense minister, Benny Gantz, has warned of civil war. Although the protests are largely focused on judicial reform and how judges to the Supreme Court will be appointed, Israel faces numerous other dilemmas, including recurring revenge attacks and gun battles between Israeli soldiers and Palestinian gunmen, rocket firings from Gaza, and Israeli bombing of Hamas targets in Gaza. Millions of Palestinians live under varying forms of Israeli control without voting or residential rights in Israel proper. Democracy cannot exist while occupying or depriving other people of their rights. America's and Israel's dilemmas are the dilemmas of much of humankind around the world. It's not just them. The radical imagination often turns to a dear colleague and friend to gain insight and have an invigorating dialogue during troubled times in Israel and the Middle East. And certainly one of those times. We're so glad to welcome Thane Rosenbaum to the show. We go way back as writers for Tikkun magazine, Thane is a novelist, essayist, law professor, and distinguished university professor at Touro University, where he directs the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society. He's the legal analyst for CBS News Radio, and his most recent book is titled Saving Free Speech from Itself. So, Thane, thank you for being here and enlightening us in your invigorating way about what is going on in Israel. I mean, you have to have been under a rock here to not realize that so much is going on. There's gunfire and protests and revenge killings and so on. Put it in some sort of context for us as a law professor, and the struggle over issues like judicial review and what's going on with the Israeli Supreme Court and so on. Or is that? I think that's a good place for us to start.
Well, Jim, first of all, it's always great sharing a screen with you. We've known each other for a long time. I have an enormous amount of respect for you, and
Same here.
you have many talents. And I think this show is great. I think the spirit of the show and you as a host is great. And I'm always here for you if you need me, because I want your audience to know that Jim can bring out anybody. All he has to do is ask.
Well, thank you so much for those kind words. And we do need your brilliance and your insight very much today, as you know.
So, we could start talking about what's happened with our own Supreme Court yesterday, right?
Yeah.
Because it is a reminder of what they don't have in Israel and what they probably need. And it might explain some of the, difficulties that you're having there. And the protests, not just among Israelis, but even among American Jews, and including President Biden, I think, has even weighed in on this issue. Look, our founding fathers, they took their time and they gave our founding documents a lot of consideration. Israel is a young democracy, but does not have any Federalist Papers, right? They didn't have time to do that kind of ongoing, rigorous debate on how to set forth their democratic institutions. They put together a country on the fly. Remember, when the country was created in 1948 in May, the very next day, 5 Arab armies attacked them. So they have never actually had a day of peace from 1948. And it explains a lot of things. So, for instance, Israel doesn't have a constitution. You're saying, what? Yeah, Israel is one of only 2 constitutional democracies in the world, the other being New Zealand, that actually doesn't have a constitution. They have what's called basic laws. And the basic laws, you can almost see, maybe like you can imagine them as the Bill of Rights. But remember, our Bill of Rights were incorporated into our Constitution. Israel always planned to finally draft one, but they never did. And so a constitution like in our system that defines the various boundaries of the 3 branches of our government doesn't exist in Israel. They have never really figured out how to make their various institutions work together. So here, just yesterday, the Supreme Court heard this opinion on student debt. And I know a lot of your listeners are academics and students, so this is in their interest. But the idea there was that President Biden had a campaign promise to forgive a portion of student debt, and he basically relied on a post 9/11 statute called the HEROES Act that said that the Department of Education can modify or reduce student debt during military emergencies or national emergencies, because the purpose of the law was to incentive to make sure that people that went off to fight the war on terror after 9/11 did not default on their student loans. That was the purpose of the law. But it also said national emergency. So 20 years later, Joe Biden looks at that law and he goes, okay, the pandemic is a national emergency. Okay.
Isn't it?
Yeah, well, right. So that's what he said. He said, hey, that's
reasonable to say that, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the Solicitor General yesterday arguing before the Supreme Court thought she was on very solid ground, right? This is a no-brainer. But the real question is, there are other constitutional priorities that the conservative wing of the Supreme Court wanted to talk about. And that major one is that the Constitution says that Congress has the power of the purse, and they deal with tax spending and allocations, appropriations. And something that is $750 billion can't be done without congressional approval. Hello, checks and balances, right?
But Thane, that's technically true, right? But we've got to also put it within a larger context of the political and economics of the country too. It's not just Congress here control the purse strings. We are a capitalistic corporate civilization that is rooted in the profits of securing profits and so on. So technically, you're absolutely right, but within the larger political economic context, as is the case in Israel too, you could make that technical legal argument, but should we be also expanding on our understanding of
well, I'm not taking sides on that student debt issue. I'm just laying it out. I'm usually play a role of a legal analyst, and I take a lot of pride in not taking sides and, giving people my legal analysis.
I get you. And Thane, you've paid off your student debt, right? Correct?
Yeah, I have no incentives here.
Great. Okay, good.
All of that is out. All I'm saying, the reason I gave you that anecdote for your audience is because it really is a good example of how our system works, of checks and balances and separation of powers. We have a dispute, right? I can tell from your perspective, you're saying, I think the president of the United States is within his rights to do such a thing, right? To you, of course. But there are people who can also take up the argument that Congress really is responsible for this kind of thing. And this is what is called a constitutional overreach, right? Overreaching one's authority, constitutional authority. Well, what the problem in Israel is, they don't have a constitution, and they don't really have any. No one really answers to any. These institutions work independently. So what you've seen is a Supreme Court that is selected only by other judges, mostly Supreme Court justices. It's not like it's here. It's selected by political figures, whether it's
legislatures and so on.
Legislators, right?
Or people themselves.
You can understand where the conflict comes there. There, it's very much inside baseball. It's dominated by people that went to law schools and became judges, and they're the ones that pick the judges. And by the way, we have to remember there's been 2 Arab Israeli justices, so they have a liberal sensibility, right? But there is an argument that their ability to find something unconstitutional is unchecked, right? That there's no checks and balances. That they have a sort of make a call that if they find that something is unreasonable, they disallow it. And it has led to a lot of impasse. Remember, our country, we have a lot of problems in Congress. Can't get legislation passed.
Right.
And the Israelis are saying the same thing, right? Or at least the conservative, ultra-nationalists and ultra-religious are saying, our country isn't working because this Supreme Court keeps stopping the government in things that it wants to get accomplished. And it interferes in areas, military in particular, security, national security, and defense, that it has no business being involved in. And I
want to hear that again. So the Supreme Court interferes. Is that what you said with the military?
I'm telling you why. What's behind this judicial overhaul? Okay. That's what's being said. If you're going to ask the Netanyahu government, why are you overhauling the judiciary? This is what they would say. They would say, we want what you have in the United States. We want checks and balances. We want to have more control over who gets to be on the court. Remember, Trump had his picks. Obama had his picks, right?
Right.
Everyone always talks about that, right? Well, imagine here in the United States, now maybe you'd say that's a good thing. What if the Supreme Court was picked by the American Bar Association? Or if the Supreme Court was picked by former justices that were still alive on the Supreme Court, like Justice Breyer and just, should now
Right.
be in the business of picking the next justice. So, I'm just giving you two different
No, I
democracies.
understand, but the fact remains same is that the president does appoint. So it is in that sense, it's unavoidable, right? It's a political
Right,
appointment.
but the Israelis are saying we
Okay.
want that.
We want that. Okay.
We want that. We don't want this to be an institution that operates separate and apart from the political sphere.
Oh.
That's what they're saying. We want it to be representative. That's what a representative democracy.
Okay.
So that even the federal judges are essentially accountable to the people because they were picked by legislators. So part of the overhaul has to do with how justices get selected. And part of the overhaul has to do with the authority that the Supreme Court presently has to simply disallow things that in this country the Supreme Court just doesn't have. And let me just say the best example of that is the Dobbs decision last year that overturned Roe v. Wade. Because as people got upset for good reason that Roe v. Wade, and surprising that Roe v. Wade was overturned,
They could turn to this.
the reality was the Supreme Court said that this is a moral matter that should be decided by the states and state legislators. Again, checks and balances, separation of power. And the Israelis would say, in our country, the Supreme Court would simply say no, and it would be over, right? It would be over. And we want what you have, which is where the Supreme Court says there's no constitutional right to an abortion, but that doesn't mean the states can't allow it. That doesn't mean that the Congress can't try to federalize a law allowing abortion.
Right.
So again, that's Israel needs a constitution, and I do think a judicial overhaul is something worth thinking about. But it's clear that this government is so conservative, so ultra-nationalist, and so ultra-religious that no one trusts them. And that's what you're seeing. When you see the protest, Jimmy, that's what you're seeing. They don't like Netanyahu. They don't trust the people that he put in his coalition government. This is the most conservative coalition government Israel has ever had. Historically, if you were a conservative prime minister, you would have to cut deals with more moderate parties in order to form a government. This time, for the first time, a conservative government was able to go into power with all guns, blazing, with only conservatives there. And that's what this is about.
Well, you sound like, I know you don't agree with everything Thomas Friedman says. You sound very much like Friedman in this case. And the editorial that he wrote this morning, just a couple of short paragraphs on this. Ask yourself this question: what Israeli leader would risk the civil war at home, a breach with Jewish Democrats across the world, a break with America, and significant damage to Israel's high-tech miracle? Because as you are aware, capital is now beginning to leave. Yeah. They're afraid of what's happening too. And now open talk by Israeli troops. And more than that, the heads of Mossad and Bet Shein and so on, that they will not die to protect a dictatorship. So is this an overstatement? One other point here. What Israeli leader would risk all of this just for a few technical judicial fixes? Netanyahu would risk all that only for something very, very big, important, and very personal. And that is a judicial reform that he hopes would end his trial on breach of trust, bribery, and fraud charges, which could land him in prison. The judicial reform would also give his right-wing coalition the unfettered power to build any settlements in any place, to seize any Palestinian land, and to pour tax dollars into Orthodox religious schools where young people have only to study the Torah, not math, science, or literature, let alone serve in the army. In other words, none of this judicial reform is on the level. As you say, they don't trust him. It's a power play that Netanyahu wants, so that with a flick of his wrist, a simple one-seat majority vote in the Knesset, he can overturn anything the Supreme Court orders. And of course, what the protesters are saying, this is the slippery slope leading to a dictatorship and to an authoritarian theocracy, perhaps. All right. So what do you say?
I would say, I don't know what Friedman would say, but I would say,
what would you say to what?
A couple things. First of all, he's absolutely right about the 61 votes override. That thing is ridiculous because it means that all you would need is 61 votes, one more than the majority,
Yeah.
to override anything that the Supreme Court. But if you said it should be 80 votes or 75 votes, would Israelis feel differently, right?
Super majority.
Right, a supermajority.
Like
So
we
I'm
would have.
saying it's not just a few technical fixes. Where I disagree with Friedman, I would say I still think that Israel, it's high time that they get themselves a constitution that lays out the different separation of powers in the institutions that govern the country. And I do think that the judiciary, especially the Supreme Court, does need not just a few it needs somewhat of an overhaul. It may not require, there's two problems here. One is this overhaul looks like it really will provide too much power to the government, the coalition government. And guess what, Jim? That's not checks and balances, right? That's not. So I don't agree with that. And as I said, Madison and Hamilton, they spent a lot of time arguing with each other to try to get it right. Now, I don't know if you think they got it right, but I'm saying they spent a lot of time. They wrote a book called The Federalist Papers.
Right.
To give you an example of how much time they spent thinking about our various liberties and how they work together and how the government functions together. The Israelis never stopped to do that. They should. And I think it would be of great benefit if they did. And I do think part of the problem is the fixes here seem very draconian and one-sided and seems to strip so much of the authority away from the Supreme Court. I get that. I understand why people are protesting.
But not only that, Thane, not only that, it not only strips authority from the secular Supreme Court, it opens up the floodgates to what the ultra-Orthodox settlers and so on, the very conservative, you want to call it that, theocratic ideology would like to see, and that doesn't involve democracy.
Right.
If you're going to really be honest about it, and I think many in that coalition would say that this is not about democracy, and that's what is so interesting. Thing, can we somehow, come up with some sort of magic here where we do retain that wonderful Israeli democratic vision, and at the same time satisfy, as you point out, as we all know, this ultra-Orthodox theocracy that seems to not be open to that.
But Jim, let me just remind you, when we use the word theocracy in that part of the world, let's not be too loose-lipped, because we're talking about Iran and other countries where there's no even attempt at a democracy. Those are true theocracies, right? And there are no freedoms for women, homosexuals, apostates, other minorities.
Well put. No,
so I'm just saying we are not anywhere near that here in Israel. You're talking about ultra-nationalist parties that are still participating in a democratic government. Let's just be clear so your audience doesn't, when they hear, that's to me a very loaded word. Let us not describe Netanyahu's government in the same way that we'd speak about the Ayatollahs. It's just,
well put,
those are not the right. So because of the region, I worry that word is this is still a democracy. And the fact that 160,000 people, many of whom are women and homosexuals, are protesting, and they haven't been torched or beheaded, tells you that this is a democratic country. Because in Iran, they would be torched and beheaded. So I just think, let's just be clear that this is a democratic country, and they are exercising their democratic rights to assemble and to protest, and let us not forget that. This is an example of a democracy at work, number one. Number two, this could have been avoided had some of the more moderate parties been willing to join a coalition with Netanyahu. That's another problem in Israel. Remember, our country, we're fixated. We only have two parties. We have 300-something million people. We only have two parties. And even a third party never really seems to materialize and generate any critical mass. I don't understand how that's happened, but it's ridiculous. The same two parties every time. Well, guess what? Not only in Israel do they have like 15 to 20 parties, but every election, some of those parties change their names and they call themselves a different thing, and they change their platform. There was a party a few years ago, I forgot their name, but they were like the marijuana party, and they actually got a lot of votes, right? They were really talking mostly about, smoking pot. So I'm just saying, Israel, this is a very messy political democratic process where you have many, many, many parties, and you need to somehow cobble together enough votes to get 61 votes in the Knesset. So and let me just say, in the history of Israel, they've never had one party come anywhere close to 61. So they always need to cobble together 4 or 5 parties to come together to form 61.
Not even the Labor Party of Ben Gurion and the Golda Meir, not even there.
No, even there, they were left-wing parties, Jim. Right? They were all on the left, but they were like Meretz was still around. Even in the end, and Menachem Begin, when that changed in 1977, he didn't have that was a landslide, and he didn't have enough votes. He needed. So I just think it's important to remember that you're dealing with a country that requires a coalition government. Here's another thing that most people watching your show probably don't realize: the last government, the one that was just preceded this one, that coalition had an Arab party in it. So when people talk about apartheid in Israel, it's absurd. It's ridiculous.
Oh, and insane. We had Dov Kennan on this show. He was one of the ones, an Israeli. He was the only Jew in the Arab Party. I forget exactly what it was called then, but yes. So he was also a member of the Communist Party.
Yeah,
but absolutely. I totally agree.
It just shows you how vibrant a democracy and how fragile their government is. It's very fragile. So what happened this time, I just think everyone watching your show should realize what happened this time is that it is a landslide government where, even though there are multiple parties, Netanyahu is the biggest liberal of all of them.
Well, he's of the left, yes. Okay, so
he is on the left wing
coalition there.
Yeah, on his coalition, he's considered liberal. The left, they don't trust him. They're afraid he's too liberal. That's what the Israelis are worried about. That they're looking. It's not just what Friedman said. I don't agree. I just think, I'm sure that Netanyahu would like to avoid this criminal prosecution, but I also think his legacy matters to him. And I don't think he's going to want Israel to go in the direction of Poland and Hungary, where you lose your democracy and you live in an authoritarian, or what people described America under Donald Trump. I don't think that he wants to be remembered. This is a guy that was educated at MIT. He knows what he knows what democracies are supposed to look like. And I just can't believe that he wants to be remembered as the guy that turned Israel into an authoritarian dictatorship. I think he's got a tough job because everyone in his government is nuts.
Well, let me just say, to give you from your mouth to God's ears. Let's put it that way. All right, but you know what? We need to touch on this because this is what also is gaining worldwide attention: is the revenge, the violence, and the pattern of revenge here, and the policy, the military and police policy that is already cut short the possibility of a 2-state solution. We pretty much forget about that right now, and it wants to. It seems, correct me if I'm wrong, some of the more extreme elements really want to run roughshod on any semblance of Palestinian human rights. Or is that too much of a statement? Too far of an extreme statement to say.
I just think it's.
What about the Palestinians in all of this, who have fundamentally no real rights within Israel proper? I understand.
No. They have exactly the same civil rights.
They don't vote.
They have this in Israel? The Arab part, the Arab Israeli?
The Israeli Arabs. I'm talking about the Palestinians now.
The Arabs in Israel are now calling themselves Palestinian Arabs. So 20% of the Israeli population, 20% are comprised of Palestinian Arabs who enjoy the full panoply of civil and religious rights. There's no difference. There's no distinction at all between an Israeli Jew and an Israeli Arab within Israel proper. They have the exact same rights. Now, are there economic disparities? Yeah, just like there is in the United States between people and color. Is it the exact? No, of course not. But in terms of the rights, those are the same. So let's just be clear. Those rights exist for Palestinians within Israel proper. Within the territory,
the increased levels of violence that we're watching.
But that's in the territories, right? So what I would say about that is, I don't know of any situation where either the settlers or the army, and someone can correct me, but I'm a student of this game. So I've been at it for a long time. I have no memory ever of Israel initiating any of the conflict. Not once. Every time.
When you say Israel, the Israeli governmental
either the settlers who are responding to attacks on their people, and that they may in fact overreach. That may be true. And by the way, when that happens, you know what happens? They go to jail. This is a democratic country. You know, HBO did that series a few years ago about what happened in 2014 in Gaza when they burned alive a young Palestinian boy. Those guys are serving life sentences. You know, they don't get rewarded with street names like they do in Gaza for killing Jews. In Israel, when the settlers commit crimes, they are pulled out of the settlements and they are in an Israeli courtroom and they go to jail. And they serve life sentences.
Well, that's not what the ultra-Orthodox part of the coalition is saying they're going to accept now.
I agree. That's very worrisome. That's exactly. But what I am saying is, when we describe these military exercises, whatever you call them, maneuvers, in each instance, they are always intended to root out terrorism. They have no interest in Israeli Palestinian civilians. Unfortunately, the civilians are living side by side with Islamic Jihad and Hamas and other terrorist organizations. But Israel, you know, it's as if people are not being intellectually honest about there is a problem in the fact that the Palestinians have rejected 5 peace proposals and have demonstrated they just don't want to live with Jews and share the land. That's why they sing from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. River to the sea, you know what that means? No Jews. It means the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, Palestine will be rid of its Jews. The fact that the Palestinians have rejected 5 peace proposals, as President Clinton would say, to him, he was, you know, he was leaving office. The Camp David agreement gave the Palestinians purportedly 98% of what they asked for. 98%. Bill Clinton thought he would be going out, leaving the White House with this extraordinary victory. And the Palestinians didn't even come back with a counteroffer. They came back with the Intifada. So what does that tell you?
Yeah, but it tells me, and much of our audience too, that we're in a very toxic pattern that's got to be broken. This cycle of violence, we can go back through the ages and decades, and you did this and they did this. That's got to somehow turn around.
But let me just say, you know, Amos Oz, who was one of Israel's most famous novelists, was also one of the founders of the Peace Now movement.
Yes.
All right. So, you know, I know you and I know we go way back to Tikkun. You know, people look at me sometimes and think I'm conservative, and I say, "Are you kidding me? I was a literary editor for Tikkun magazine. My progressive bona fides are pretty strong.
You just mentioned my name and you're fine.
Anyway, exactly. Use the name Jim Vrettos. That tells you right away.
I use your name. We're comrades.
So you may not be. People may not be happy with things that I've said, but I know that I come from the right place. I starting out at the right place, and I'm saying so did Amos Oz. And
Yeah.
and I just think this is an anecdote that's very important. You may not have heard it, but it's a great anecdote, and your audience will I hope they'll internalize it. So remember, Amos Oz is one of the founders of the Peace Now movement, right? A leader of the let's do everything we can to find a way to live in peace with Palestinians, right? Whatever it takes. When the Gaza war of 2000, I guess it was 14 or 16, I can't remember which one it was. For some reason, I'm thinking it was 2014. In 2014, that war, which was very bloody and was as very much another recycling of the violence that you described properly. Amos Oz was on a book tour in Germany, right? And they were supposed to talk about the book, but he was on a television show, like a Jim Vrettos show, Radical Imagination.
Okay.
And they said, before we talk about the new novel, we'd like to talk about the situation in Israel, the war with Gaza and Hamas. Is there something you want to say? And they thought they were talking to the leader of the Peace Now movement. Right. And this is what he said, Jim. I don't know if you remember this story. It's a great anecdote. He said, you live next door to me. You have a house. You put your son on your knee, and then you point a machine gun at my child's bedroom and start firing into the bedroom with your child on the knee. What am I supposed to do? Then he said, give me a second example. Amos Oz gave another one. He said, you live next door to me, and I discover that you have built a tunnel under my house, from your house, running from your house to my house, and it leads to my children's nursery so that you would kill them. What am I supposed to do?
Yeah.
And everyone was silent, because the answer is, what are you supposed to do?
It's got to be on both sides.
What are you supposed to do? And when Amos Oz gave that example, believe me, Jim, they did not attach
to it.
They did not expect that. They were shocked. And I like that
anecdote. I like that very, very much. And I will remember that. Listen, I've had Rashid Khalidi on too, who would agree with you that the Palestinian leaders have missed the opportunity.
Oh my God.
There's corruption there too. And he is one of probably the leading Palestinian spokesman, American Palestinian spokesman we have in the country. Now, you know what? I would like to very briefly tell you about an event I was at just last week that involved actually Rashid Khalidi, and see what you think about it as a vehicle through which we can begin the process of stopping this pattern of violence. Because, as you know, as many of us know, and as mentioned to you with the Institute of Prevention of Violence that we're trying to get going too, hurt people hurt others. We can go around and around and around who's been traumatized the most and so on. We're dealing with traumatized, hurt people. Now, how do we heal that? Tikkun. How do we heal and transform the world? I was at an incredible event last Thursday, and it was the Edward Said Memorial Lecture, Education Through Music, a legacy of Edward Said. You probably know about this.
Of course.
Yeah. Of course. Okay, so you know where I'm going on this. The panelist was Miriam Said, the vice president of the wife of Edward Said. Michael Berenbaum was there, the son of Daniel Berenbaum, who has carried on the tradition of both Edward and his father, who's still alive, but is not
right.
Well, there was an Israeli violinist, Miriam Monashavarov. I'm going to try to have her on the show, and a Palestinian. So here's the point. They weren't naive about this. You play a few concerts and wow, here we are in the promised land and peace and harmony and so on. But they were profound friends who believed that music was a badge for understanding and a tool for education. Advocates for the importance of humanistic education as the basis for a more just and humane world. Berenbaum and Said began an experiment in cultural communication through music that lasts to this day. The West Eastern Divine Orchestra, the flagship program of the Berenbaum Said Foundation, brings together the youth from Israel, Palestine, and other Arab countries to play music and learn together in hopes of breaking down the barriers that divide. And they performed, and I know you know about this. And This is what
The problem is,
breaks me up is that they can play anywhere in the world, but Israel's present government will not allow them to play there.
so, what I would say to that is what I always said. And I think one of the times I was on your show and you used the term of art, which is very much a Vrettos, vernacular, radical loving, right? I think that's
Cornel West. That's Reverend William Barber.
Yeah, I know, but you've been promoting that idea for many, many years.
Well, you did too.
I know.
Okay.
But the difference is when I think of Korn and Michael and all of our friends from that era, and I think of what you
They're
just
still
described.
around. They're still at that era. Go ahead. Yeah.
What's that? Yeah, right. They're still around, and the Edward Said conference you were just talking about. When I see that, I go, yeah, if that was the leadership of both governments, it would be great. I mean, the problem is, at least on the Palestinian side, they're not poets, they're not musicians.
Now, wait a minute. Come on.
The people.
Wait a minute. Come on now. What did you just do here and say? What do you mean they're not poets? They're not musicians. They're not artists? How? Listen, I love you.
No. The government.
Oh, okay. I thought you're just
no. I said if we could put those, if you could put those people, the people from the Edward Said,
absolutely,
and if you could put I'm saying
Amos Oz.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm saying get me the Palestinian poets, bring me the Palestinian violinists. I want them. They never get anywhere near the government. And by the way, if they tried, they'd get their heads cut off.
Well,
right?
but there is a conservatory in Ramallah too.
I know, but the government is run by bureaucrats with a long history of blood on their hands. Right. I wrote for the Washington Post a few years ago about the Taylor Force Act. I don't know if you followed that, but the Taylor Force Act was written to deprive Palestinian Authority of money that was going to be used to compensate people who they called their martyrs, who kill and injure Jews.
I understand. Yeah,
right. And I wrote it in a Sunday essay about the Taylor Force Act because what I learned is what a twisted government their situation is that the more a terrorist the more they kill, the more violent the crime, the more of a life stipend their family gets, tuition benefits.
The more violent retaliation to that violence is only going to bring more violence. That's the problem.
But we're talking about a system that incentivizes the killing of Jews and then rewards when you get out of jail, you are rewarded with a government job. So what I'm saying is the government in the Palestinian Authority and certainly in Gaza are represented not by poets and not by the kinds of people that you are on your show. Let's just be clear. So when you say that, Rashid Khalidi, he's right. The Palestinians have not been represented well. There's been a lot of cronyism and corruption. And unfortunately, they've been led by people that have an eliminationist perspective on how to deal with the Jews. They do not have a side-by-side, let's join an orchestra together.
All right. But Thane, I'm agreeing with everything you're saying on this. But so what we need to do, we can't affect the entire Arab world or Palestine, but we can affect the American Jewish world, the Israeli world, as you try to do. So this is what I think the reality of this is to extend this narrative to our Jewish brothers and sisters and people who are.
But just tell me. But let me ask you, Jim, if you extended that message,
right,
what would you have them do?
Well, first thing I would have the concert held. I think you would find, and I've had a number of Israeli filmmakers on. Barak Heyman, for example, as one who's worked with Palestinian filmmakers. I would support that sort of efforts.
But Jim, 80%, the polling is very clear, Jim. It's very important to remember. 80% of the Israeli population would be thrilled to live in peace with side by side with a Palestinian country. 80%. Those are, it's a huge number.
And
now,
I
many
think
of them, unfortunately,
a large percentage of Palestinians, believe it or not, would do the same. The studies in the past have shown that. Now we're also angry and polarized and more violent. You're not going to find those numbers today among the Israelis or the Palestinians. But I think you're right. I think the vast majority on both people are people, sick and tired of the death and the killing.
They should be.
They
when
are.
I think about the tragedy, I wrote an essay for Haaretz a number of years ago. Again, can't go more left wing than that. So, can't get more. And I wrote an essay, and I wasn't even joking. I said that if Hamas had called Sheldon Adelson, who was the casino magnate in Las Vegas and Macau and Jewish, and a right wing, he died recently, but he was sort of he financed all right wing causes, all settlements. So he's not. If they called him up and they said,
to Jerusalem and so on.
He's very right wing. If they called him up and said, Mr. Adelson, or whatever they called him, and they said, we are Hamas, we would like to build casinos and hotels, because let me tell you, they're right on the Mediterranean Sea. Gaza could be a knockout. It doesn't have to be a shithole. It could be a knockout.
You didn't mean that to say that. You didn't mean to sound like Donald Trump there.
But it is a shithole. I mean,
but you know what? Wait a minute.
They don't invest.
Dane, you're channeling me. Listen to me. I was looking this up because I was so pissed at the fact that this concert could not be held in Israel. I literally looked things up. Sharm el-Sheikh has a beautiful outdoor arena and facility where this concert could be held. And it's not far from Israel. We could have this there, an international festival that would include many Israelis. I mean, this is the sort of people-to-people interaction that you need to begin to have.
I agree. Anybody who believes, any sensible person has to agree with it. But what I'm saying is, there has been no willingness to engage in statesmanship, nation building, the kinds of things. My point of that essay was, Adelson would have been on his private jet immediately. He would have said, let's form a partnership. I will help you build hotels. Let's make this place the Riviera. Let's make this place Macau. It doesn't, if Hamas was not importing weapons from Iran, if they were not importing cement for the purposes of building tunnels, but instead were importing violins for their students, for their kids to learn so that they can attend this concert, the Israelis would have no embargo by air or sea. There's be no reason.
And let's also include our contribution, considerable more than anyone, to the military buildup in the area as well, supporting the Saudi Arabians, for example, in the war in Yemen. So there's enough blame to go around, the hypocrisy. I agree with you on all of this. So we've got to come up with these alternative visions that I think we are being able to do. You've got to get in touch with some of your billionaire friends there who's taken over for Sheldon, and we will connect them with
Jim, that call is not coming from Hamas. They don't want that. They don't, and until they want Gaza, until they see, we are sitting on beautiful property on the Mediterranean Sea, and we could turn this to a tourist environment that people would come. It would be a knockout.
Yeah.
You don't hear that language from Palestinian governments, and so until you do, if they can renounce violence, renounce terrorism, and accept the idea of living side by side with a Jewish state, I think peace. Who wouldn't want that?
Well, there have been efforts. We agree with what you're saying here. Now, though, with this right wing,
it's going to get worse. I agree.
They're losing money. Your billionaire entrepreneurs are taking money away. So we've got to change that narrative. There's got to be, and maybe this is ironically the government that could do this. maybe Netanyahu, for his legacy, can get the backbone and say, you know what, let's have some sort of pilot project between the two peoples.
Let us not
Why not?
forget.
China and Nixon, open up, break this barrier. Saddam coming over.
Let us not forget. Yes, you're right. Sorry to interrupt, but let us not forget that Israel's biggest warrior, its most famous warrior, was Ariel Sharon. And when Ariel Sharon was prime minister, he unilaterally withdrew from Gaza. And not only withdrew, but he also had to dismantle all the Jewish settlements in Gaza at enormous.
They didn't boycott it. They didn't have the positive programs and policies to bring people together. Correct? Saying that's what was lacking.
No. They simply withdrew from Hamas. They said, we're going to give you. There is not a single Jew that lives in Gaza. Not one. Why doesn't Hamas have a country? Why? There's not a single Jew. Now, you might say, well, because there's an embargo. Yeah, you know who also participates in the embargo? Egypt, not just Israel.
Not only that.
Egypt.
Well, I've had her on the show. Other Jews, Medea Benjamin, for example, who are in the flotillas. I love her also. But all right, listen, we've almost come to the end of our show, and I think we've moved the arrow considerably. We still have a ways to go,
Well, no, it does show that our hearts are in the right place, and I think that's the key thing of all humanity. If they can show where their hearts are in the right place, we need more people who can do that. Absolutely, radical love, and a transformation of the heart and soul and mind. All with you. Thank you, Thane. It's always a pleasure. It's an honor. It's a blessing. I remember, yes, I did. We wrote together. Actually, I wrote an article. I was upset with a particular article you wrote about, I think it was the Norwegian terrorists there. I called it unnecessary vengeance. But that was many years ago. Yes, I remember that. Yeah, well, listen, we have a meeting of the minds on many, many things. And really, God bless you. And thank you so very much. Love you, my friend. Love you too. Take care. All the best. All right. And thank you so very, very much for watching The Radical Imagination. This is Jim Vrettos. We'll see you again next week on The Radical Imagination.